Welcome to Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin. Today, my dear subscribers, my dear guests, and listeners to this program, I would like to focus on the row over Greenland and how it affects the war in Ukraine and Russian policy. Now, most importantly, of course, it is all connected with the meeting of world leaders at the World Economic Forum in Davos, and various speeches and various meetings that are going on that try to define the policy of Europe towards the unexpected new crisis that has arisen over Greenland. Now, the title of my presentation is The Row Over Greenland, Does Europe Have a Policy? And of course, this is a crucial question because a lot depends as to what Europe is going to do in response to Trump's push to take over Greenland. And then, as we all know, the imposition of sanctions and the threat of more tariffs in case they don't go along, and then the escalation of the row between President Macron and Trump over threat of 2% tariffs on France, and so on it goes. So the question is, does Europe have a policy? And here is the crucial here is the speech that Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, gave on the 20th today, and she outlined what looks like a programmatic speech. That she outlined the course of action and the priorities of European policy, especially in regard to Greenland, although she spoke on it only in the end, and it was clear that she was not ready to speak about it, but she had to, given the circumstances. And this is where a lot of interesting things and contradictions occurred in her speech and the way she defined Europe's objectives. So she spoke a lot about economic policies and about integration, and if you divide her speech on the priorities list, it is mostly on domestic issues of Europe and its foreign affairs. And a domestic one is everything's great and it's going to be more integration, less taxes, more freedom of trade, etc., etc. But on the foreign policy, she focused, and this is unsurprising, on Ukraine as a first priority. And that means that she repeated exactly the same things that have been said before many times, that the European Union gave a loan to Ukraine. She spoke about Russian aggression. She continued to keep the course on Ukraine, make it stronger, give it more money, give it more weapons, and it essentially, as if nothing changed, the course is the same. Now, obviously, one constantly expects an answer to her question: would that continue at the same level of support of a country that is not in the European Union, and in view of the fact that now you have a situation when a member of the NATO alliance is claiming territory of another member of a NATO alliance and of the European Union, and whether that deserves a robust response, just as so-called aggression of Russia required from Europe. Now, the speech suggests that for Ursula von der Leyen and those who support her, it seems that the war in Ukraine still remains a priority, and still remains the goals have not changed. Military support will continue. However, she could not bypass Greenland, and I tried to figure out what her position would be if the crisis accelerates, which is likely what is going to happen. Now, she said that the European Union will show solidarity with Denmark, that the status of Greenland as Danish is non-negotiable. In other words, the sovereignty of Denmark over Greenland will be supported by the European Union, and if the United States goes into economic tariffs, then the European Union would respond in kind, and therefore this suggests that some kind of a trade war may indeed happen. And I'll speak in a moment what it would imply for Europe and for the United States. But attentive listening suggests that von der Leyen offered a kind of an olive branch to Trump by presenting the case of Greenland as a joint project of defense against supposedly Russia and China, that should be done by NATO. In other words, what she is saying to Trump, let's declare it that this is our joint defense of the Arctic area from the Russians and the Chinese. You, America, will be in charge, and you can do whatever you want in Greenland, but the sovereignty should remain Danish. So this is the message to Trump. Okay. Then she goes on to say that on Latin America, there was a treaty signed a few days ago. Finally, after many years of negotiations, Mercosur is on the free trade agreement between Latin America and Europe. Now, that also is a direct challenge to Trump. Trump declared Latin America to be a Monroe zone, Monroe Doctrine zone, a corollary to Monroe Doctrine, which means no European presence or influence or power in Latin America. So here you have a Trump who challenges Europe in two ways. First, he says that your piece of land, Greenland, will be mine, will be American. And second, he says, you want to have free trade with Latin America. Well, that is an area of our exclusive economic interest. In other words, there's already a kind of a two-track conflict with the European Union. Now, the problem with the Ursula von der Leyen's approach is that she cannot have the cake and eat it too. She cannot have pretense of NATO joint cooperation against Russia in Greenland or over North Arctic, and at the same time conduct a kind of an economic competition with the United States in Latin America, and a kind of a war of tariffs between the two. So that means that the bottom line of her policy is the declaration of war on Russia as before over Ukraine, and confiscating Russian assets, making it irreversible and final. But at the same time, an attempt to appease Trump and to get him on board to accept the formula that he can have Greenland, but the sovereignty will remain Danish. Now, but that's not what Trump wants, and she doesn't want to understand it. Trump does not want just to do what he wants in Greenland. He can do it anyway. He wants an American flag. He wants to show success for midterm elections. He wants to have Latin America as an exclusive zone of American exploitation and not a free economic zone with Europe. So this is a collision course, and she kind of refuses to acknowledge or to understand that that is the case. Now, moreover, if we go to the reaction of other European countries, one has to take into consideration the fact that the countries that are most concerned about Greenland are the North European countries, and these are the ones that are most hostile to Russia. And that is probably why Ursula von der Leyen is trying to combine these two. she's saying to them, we will continue the war against Russia, we will continue to support Ukraine, but we will have to come to an understanding with the United States. And these countries, of course, are Sweden and Finland and Denmark and Norway and Britain and Germany, all North European countries. And this is why her position is untenable, because you can't have the cake and eat it too. You cannot have a policy against Russia and against the United States at the same time, because Europe cannot have it has to have supply of oil and gas. It used to be Russia, then they switched to the United States, and now they're dependent on the United States supply, and now they are in economic war with the United States, and therefore it is something that is untenable. Now, there is an offer from Putin that I discussed in my previous video to have a new architecture of relations in Europe that is a possibility to turn the page and restore supply of oil, and that would give some kind of a hope that Europe in that case could rely more on Russia and oppose Trump's offensive against Europe in Greenland. But for that, one would have to have a policy not led by von der Leyen, but by somebody else who is willing to look at the possibility of rapprochement with Russia. And that brings to mind President Macron, who is much, much more now at odds with President Trump. And also at the southern Europeans, especially Italy, possibly Spain, and of course Hungary, who have been urging an opening to Russia well before that. So this is the kind of a crossroads for Europe. On the one hand, it could go on the escalatory ladder together against Russia and against the United States, but at the same time, you cannot continue that policy without serious economic difficulties for Europe. It has to have a choice between one or the other. Either peace and oil and gas from Russia, and that means accepting negotiated settlement on the Ukraine war on Russian terms, or it is surrender to Trump and surrender of Greenland and strengthening of NATO that nobody believes in anymore. And in that case, there is a kind of a attempt to revive NATO. Now, the conclusion of this, of course, is that the damage to NATO has already been done. The damage has been done whether NATO will survive or not. The damage is in that NATO cannot resolve the issue of sovereignty, that one country wants the territory of another, and it wasn't Russia that is attacking a sovereign territory of a NATO state, but it is a NATO state too, such as the United States. So that gives a kind of this row over Greenland gives a certain advantage to Russia, because Ukraine is already off the agenda, and everybody understands that Europe, that has spent hundreds of billions in supporting Ukraine, a non-EU member, now is not in the capacity to support its own member against the military threat of the United States. For the war in Ukraine, the impact is profound. It simply means that there are no weapons for Ukraine anymore, that the Europeans are not going to buy European weapons and supply them to Ukraine when they need to defend Denmark. It means there is no more money for Ukraine, as they need their own money in their economic dispute with the United States. It also means that the future of NATO as a military alliance is in question. So this is the fallout from the impetuous decision of President Trump to claim Greenland. And this is all for today, my dear friends. Please subscribe. Please write your comments. And please read my book, From Vladimir Lenin to Vladimir Putin.